Max Verstappen does it again and puts together an incredible qualifying lap to take another unexpected pole position. The McLarens looked like the fastest car all weekend, but Max just edges out Oscar Piastri by 100th of a second to push Piastri into P2 for the start of the race. But as great as Max's lap was, the other McLaren driver is stealing the headlines coming out of qualifying as Lando Norris crashes in his first run of Q3, which puts him all the way back to 10th for the start of tomorrow's race. How detrimental will this be for Lando's bid for a world championship this year, and how much of this deficit can he recover during the Grand Prix tomorrow? We'll dissect all of this, along with everything else we've seen so far this weekend, all coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. We'll get to Max in a second, but I wanted to start with Lando and his crash in Q3. For those who missed it, Lando goes out at the beginning of Q3 for his first run. He runs a little too wide going into turn 4, which throws off his racing line going into turn 5. As a little bit of oversteer, hits the curb, overcorrects the car, and sends himself into the wall, ending his qualifying. Just a colossal mistake by Lando. And one that hurts even more because he was having a very strong weekend and looked very comfortable in the car. We've talked about how close he and his teammate have been all season, but Lando flipped the script after last weekend and really had the edge over Oscar all weekend throughout the practice sessions and the first 2 qualifying sessions. I said the same thing after Oscar's mishap in Australia, but this is a mistake that could have huge implications for the Drivers' Championship. Oscar obviously made up for that mistake in the first race of the season, but can Lando do the same? It starts with having a great recovery drive tomorrow, but it certainly will not be easy. This crash puts Lando back into 10th for the start of the race, so not only does he have 7 cars in between himself and his closest championship competitors in Max and Oscar at the front, but this is probably one of the worst possible tracks for this to happen. Jeddah is great because it's such a high-speed circuit and it's so tight around the track with the barriers, and it honestly makes for thrilling footage, especially from the onboard cameras. But on the other hand, that makes it just as hard to pass around this track. Really, the best part of this track where you can make an overtake happen is down that long front straight going into turn 1. There's also a slight chance going through the DRS zone going into turn 27, but not a lot of opportunities in the rest of the track. But also to Lando's detriment, you factor in how much the McLaren struggles in the dirty air behind other cars even when they have a DRS advantage. The start is going to be crucial for Lando tomorrow. He has to have somewhat of a repeat of what he had last weekend in Bahrain, of course without the penalty for starting outside of his grid box. The bad news, though, is this track has a pretty short run down to turn 1 from the starting grid. And Lando starting in 10th puts him right in the middle of the chaos, where he'll honestly just have to focus on making it out of those first few turns just unscathed. Now, there are some bright sides for Lando's race. Before the crash, he was right up there at the top throughout all of the practice sessions in Q1 and Q2. You look at the McLaren's race pace on the long runs during the practice sessions, they were at the top. Lando has the pace to make up for this error if he can manage to make some overtakes happen. Looking at who's ahead of him on the starting grid, you expect him to get past Gasly, Tsunoda, Hamilton, and Sainz. You also expect him to probably get ahead of Kimi Antonelli and Charles Leclerc, but that might be where things get difficult, where they just have enough pace to stay ahead of him. Lando has to be hoping for a safety car or red flag at some point to save him from this. And considering the history of those two things happening at this track, I expect we'll see Lando go long in his first stint and hold out for that possibility. But as much as it could help him, it could also hurt his race just as much. But starting in this position, it's almost a risk you have to take. But unless we see something absolutely crazy happen tomorrow and Lando manages to somehow win the race, or at least finish ahead of Oscar, this crash is going to sting for a while. But if he can somehow manage to get into the top 3, he has to be happy with his efforts to make the most out of this situation. Going off of Lando's mishap and what it could mean for the Drivers' Championship, his teammate Oscar Piastri has a huge opportunity to capitalize on this moment tomorrow. Right now he sits 3 points behind Lando in the standings, but after qualifying, everything makes you think that Oscar will come out of this weekend in the lead for the Drivers' Championship. I'm sure he'll try his best to get around Max at the start, but I don't think his chances of winning the race rest on that moment like they did in Japan. It's a night race, of course, but this is still Saudi Arabia. It's hot, and that means there's a good chance Red Bull struggles with the tire wear again, which should give Oscar the advantage to get around Max at some point during this race. Oscar needs a clean start, but more importantly, he just needs a clean race. And he's probably, contrary to his teammate, hoping that there aren't any safety cars and there aren't any red flags to mix things up. But if Oscar can get around Max at the start, I expect we see him race off into the distance like we saw in Bahrain. And we might not even see much of him on the race broadcast other than maybe his pit stops and when he takes the checkered flag. Let's talk about Max Verstappen. It's incredible how many times we see this happen with him, where the car is off the pace in the practice sessions and we get to qualifying and he manages to pull it all together and extract the most out of this car. But for Max to come away with this pole was still pretty unexpected. I mean, looking at the practice sessions, Max was almost 6/10 off the lead in FP1, almost 3/10 off the lead in FP2, and almost 8/10 off the lead in FP3. This pole just didn't seem possible for him, but here we are, yet again, watching him put together a flawless lap around one of the hardest circuits on the calendar. And Red Bull took a huge risk with Max in Q3 that helped him secure this position. So Lando crashes out and brings out the red flag. The session restarts with 8.5 minutes left. And most teams are looking at the clock thinking, okay, we probably only have time for one more run at the end of the session. Not Red Bull. They send Max out right away so he can have 2 qualifying laps, but they have to put extra fuel in his car so he can make it work because they won't have time to refuel his car after the first run. Normally, this would slow drivers down pretty significantly in qualifying. Not this one. He tops Piastri on his first run by 100th of a second, which I'm sure gave him some confidence, but also just gave him some comfort going into those final runs of Q3. Looking at his final run in Q3, though, Max won this pole in the first sector. He gained about 1/10 of a second on Oscar in that first sector, and Oscar was faster in the second and third sectors, but Max built up enough of an advantage to stay ahead and take the pole position. He's just pushing this car to the absolute limit, and you could tell by his radio message after he was told he got pole and his post-qualifying interview that he was extremely proud of this one. I mentioned it with Oscar a second ago, but the race will be a different challenge for Max. I don't think he'll tumble down the grid because this is such a high-speed circuit and Red Bull does do better at a track like this than others. But the tire degradation and overall race pace issues that Red Bull has dealt with probably become a factor at some point during the race. And there's a good chance that'll take Max out of contention for a win. I do expect Max to make it onto the podium, though, especially with Lando so far behind. He probably won't be faster than Oscar over an entire race. He might not be faster than George, but Max should at least be faster than the others behind him. And who knows? Maybe if he stays out in front at the start of the race, he can manage the pace in clean air like we saw in Japan and hold off everyone else behind him. Sticking with Red Bull, Yuki Tsunoda qualifies 8th, almost a second slower than Max, which isn't necessarily ideal, but still a step in the right direction for the team and for Yuki. This is the best qualifying result for the second Red Bull driver since Baku of last year, which is pretty shocking. But Yuki, he just needs to keep this momentum going. Sure, he's still pretty far off of Max, but honestly, how many drivers wouldn't be in this situation? The important thing is he's shown improvement every weekend since moving to Red Bull, and these are at least the type of performances that should keep him in this seat moving forward. But we all know the points are won on Sunday, and Yuki will have to turn this qualifying result into a solid race result. Going to Ferrari, the struggles continue. At the start of the weekend after FP1, I was thinking, all right, Ferrari might have been right about this new floor at this track, and they might actually be turning things around, with Leclerc only being 7/100ths off the lead. But then FP2 came, and then FP3 came, and then qualifying came, and it just got worse and worse for this team. Charles Leclerc qualifies P4, which on paper doesn't look terrible, but he was almost 4/10 off of Verstappen's fastest time in Q3. Lewis Hamilton qualifies P7, almost a second slower than Max, after he barely even made it into Q3. Turns 1 and 2 are killing this team this weekend. Looking at the qualifying times on average, they're the ninth slowest team in these two corners. After qualifying, both drivers and Fred Vasseur attributed this to the struggles warming up the tires at the beginning of the lap. So there is some hope for the race because that is more of a qualifying issue, just trying to put together one perfect lap. But Leclerc also complained about just a lack of grip with the car going around this track, and there's not much that gives you hope of that changing during the race. But the way this team was talking about this weekend made you think we'd see Ferrari's first podium this weekend, and maybe if they were lucky, even a race win. But we are far from that. Now, granted, this is only race 5 out of 24, so it is still early, but I'm just going to say it. Lewis Hamilton looks washed. Leclerc has now outqualified him 4-1 and is 3-0 against him in race results, 4-0 if you don't count the DQs in China. He just doesn't look like he has the pace anymore. And realistically, this was a concern signing a driver at this age this late in his career. Your reflexes and reaction times start to go as you age. And typically, drivers aren't willing to take those big risks that they were comfortable taking when they were younger. We all expected Leclerc to have the edge over Hamilton initially, but the difference we've seen so far between these two drivers is alarming. How about Williams? Well, at least Carlos Sainz coming out of qualifying, but both cars have looked really fast all weekend. It makes sense because this is a fast circuit, which traditionally has been one that suits their driving style and suits this car a little better. A tough break for Alex Albon in qualifying, though. The team probably sent him out a little bit too early on his last run of Q2. He ends up missing out on Q3 by 7 thousandths of a second, so very, very close margins. If the team sent him out a little later with the rest of the pack, you have to think the track warming up would have given him enough to get into Q3. But he qualifies 11th, Sainz qualifies 6th. This is the second straight weekend Sainz has outqualified his replacement at Ferrari in Lewis Hamilton. Now, unfortunately for Williams, it does look like they will struggle with tire degradation and race pace for the Grand Prix. We didn't get the full extent of the long runs in the free practice sessions because of the red flags, but they struggled in this area from what we did see compared to the other teams. Regardless of that, there's a good chance both of these cars are in the points tomorrow, and the difficulty passing should be very favorable for Sainz if that's the case. Not a whole lot to talk about with Mercedes, but another strong qualifying performance from both drivers. George Russell qualifies 3rd, Kimi Antonelli qualifies 5th. Depending on what happens with Lando and the level of tire degradation and race pace Max deals with, there's a good chance we see George back on the podium yet again. Mr. Consistency. Kimi still hasn't beaten George in qualifying or a race, but he's at least shown signs of improvement every weekend. Well, almost every weekend, but he's in the range that you would expect from a rookie driver in this car. All right, just a few other quick thoughts on the rest of the grid and then some race predictions for Sunday. Another good qualifying result for Pierre Gasly and Alpine in 9th. Unfortunately, Jack Doohan qualifies all the way down in 17th, which hurts for him, but Gasly is at least making the most out of this car and is in a really good position to take home a points finish on Sunday. Going to the Racing Bulls, not the best qualifying performance by them, qualifying 12th and 14th, but Liam Lawson out-qualifies Isaac Hadjar, which is a very good sign for him. He honestly looks like he's just getting more and more comfortable in this car and really starting to put that ugly Red Bull exit behind him. Not a great qualifying for Haas. 15th for Ollie Beerman, 19th for Esteban Ocon. But the good news for this team is we've seen them turn these poor qualifying results into solid race results. So maybe they can repeat that for tomorrow. Things aren't good for Aston Martin, but at least Fernando Alonso qualifies 13th thanks to a very fortunate slipstream he got in qualifying. His teammate Lance Stroll, though, just set the all-time record in F1 for most Q1 exits. Not the type of stat you want to have your name to. Going to my race predictions, though, again, this is a very tough track to pass, so I think a lot will come down to the order that we have after lap 1. It's never a full guarantee that we'll have a safety car, but this track is probably as close as we get to that. We've only had 4 races at this track, but every single one has had a safety car. Watch out for that during the race because the timing of that can really change a lot, as we know. And there's also a high chance that we get a red flag with one of those incidents too, just because the track is so tight and it's so hard to recover vehicles safely. And we all know how a red flag can affect the strategy and really mix up the race results. My podium predictions for Sunday, though: in P3, I have George Russell. In P2, I have Max Verstappen. And in P1, taking home the win and the lead of the Drivers' Championship, I have Oscar Piastri. Even with Max possibly out front after the first few laps, I think it'll be too much for him to keep Oscar behind in second. The McLarens have just looked so strong at this track all weekend long. And on top of that, I think we're going to see a very determined and motivated Oscar Piastri, ready to make the most out of his teammates' mishaps. I think Max does hold off George, though, even if George has the faster car, but we should see a solid race by both drivers. I do expect Lando to make it all the way up to P4, with Kimi and Charles Leclerc behind him. Again, it'll be difficult to pass, but I think the McLaren is just too strong and will have the pace to get around those two cars. Lewis probably slots into P7, but watch out for Yuki Tsunoda mixing things up there too. But after that, the rest of the points finishers likely come down to the two Williams drivers and Pierre Gasly. And for those two midfield teams, points are extremely valuable, so we should see a good fight for those positions. All right, that's a wrap on today's episode previewing the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. I'll be honest, I don't expect this to be the most exciting race, but I do think we still will get a few moments of excitement, especially at the race start. I do think we'll see some solid overtakes throughout the race, especially Lando working his way back up the field. And I think we're getting that safety car, and possibly even a red flag. And hopefully, based on the timing of that, it really mixes things up with the race order and with strategies. I will, of course, be back with another episode tomorrow recapping the Grand Prix and everything that we saw during the race. And hopefully we've got a lot to talk about. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Like always, until next time.